reporting there. Well, as we've been hearing, the British Prime Minister is heading to Paris this Friday for bilateral talks with Emmanuel Macron, where the contentious issue of illegal migration across the Channel will likely dominate that summit. Our press reviewer, Deepti Laurent, is here to take us through it.
It's the first bilateral summit in 5 years between the two countries since Brexit, of course, really drew a wedge or drove a wedge between the two countries. It's on the front page of Libération today, which says in French, "Nice to see you again." And you see Rishi Sunak and Emmanuel Macron there in a loving embrace on a teacup. The two leaders have quite a few things in common, Libération tells us. They're former bankers. They're relatively young, between 40 and 45 years of age. And also, both of them are former economy and finance ministers. Will they be friends or enemies? That's a big question, Libération says in its editorial today. It's also on the front page of the right-wing French paper Le Figaro, who's focusing more on the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who says here that he wants to open a new chapter with France. Those are words quoted from an interview he's actually given to the newspaper, which is also in its edition today, where he talks about his hopes for this meeting with Emmanuel Macron. Le Figaro's editors reminding us that Britain needs Europe, whether it likes to admit it or not, on issues of economy, migration and defence. That's in its editorial on the front page right here, Sharon.
And what's the reaction been then from the British papers, Deepti?
Well, it's quite a subdued response, actually. We only found one British paper that was focusing on this visit on its front page. That's The Independent today, which is focusing here on on that meeting between Emmanuel Macron and Rishi Sunak. You see the paper there quoting Macron's a vision of things as saying the small boats crisis is your problem, not ours, noting that Rishi Sunak is suffering a blow ahead of that French summit as Macron is set to reject his call to take back migrants who cross the Channel. It's also the focus of the cartoonist for the Times of London, Peter Brooks here, who sees Emmanuel Macron as a French can-can dancer, telling Rishi Sunak today that it's not le cancan, it's le can't. A bit of an easy pun, but it's one that's pretty funny nonetheless, Sharon.
On a more serious note, let's head to Mexico next, where the kidnappings and the subsequent murders of 2 of 4 Americans has taken an even stranger twist. What's happening there?
Well, it's in the Washington Post today. So 4 Americans, as we know, had traveled to Mexico in a minivan last year, reportedly for a medical procedure. After they crossed into Mexico from the southern tip of Texas, they were fired upon and kidnapped. They were found this week in a wooden shack on the outskirts of Matamoros, that city in Mexico right on the border with Texas. 2 of the 4 Americans had been killed. Well, yesterday, early Thursday, 5 men, allegedly cartel members, were tied up alive, found near the intersection where the American tourists had been kidnapped. A note claiming to be from a Gulf cartel faction said it wanted to hand over those responsible for the kidnappings. It could be, as the Washington Post says in its article here today, a macabre form of public relations, a strategy often employed by Mexican crime groups. It's also the focus of the Mexican papers. This opinion writer for El Universal writes that the kidnappings show that the complete control that cartels have over that border with Texas. The new arrivals, he said, the American tourists, were immediately detected by cartel members. The deaths of 2 of the tourists, however, do mark the beginning of a new form of political and diplomatic pressure from the U.S. on the Mexican president and on his government to do more to curtail the cartels in the country. Some Republican lawmakers have called on Joe Biden to add cartels to the terror list. Others have even called for U.S. military intervention, Sharon.
Finally, Deepti, I'm intrigued. A movie fan on Twitter has sparked a rather hilarious question about foreign translations of titles of Hollywood films, with a special focus on French translations. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is a really fun conversation to read about, and it's pretty timely considering that the Oscars are just around the corner. So Juan Ruiz, his name is, he's a Twitter user who sort of sparked this conversation when he posted this comparison of The Hangover, the movie The Hangover, and its French translation, which is Very Bad Trip. So it sort of sparked this whole conversation about how the French like to translate English language titles into English for its French audience, but an English that's deemed more understandable or more comprehensible for a French audience. Anyway, this Twitter feed has been viewed 10 million times. This is probably the most well-known example of, let's call it sort of awkward French translations of Hollywood movies, but there are so many more. You have Step Up 2, which in English sort of makes sense, but the French did translate it to Sexy Dance 2, and you'll see there's actually a theme there. Sharon, this movie, A Short History of Decay, was translated in France as Sexy Therapy. So apparently you put sexy in front of any movie and the French sort of understand straight away what it's about. The recently released film Cocaine Bear was translated to Crazy Bear in France, but let's be honest, it's not just French titles. The film Cool Runnings, a cult Disney film about the Jamaican bobsled team, Cool Runnings, was translated in France into as Rasta Rockets, but around the world, you'll see there are some very strange translations. In Brazil, it was translated into Jamaica below 0 degrees. In the Canadian province of Quebec, it was translated into the sort of champions in the making. My favorite one, though, was its title in Norway, as you see here. It was actually translated into cold buttocks, Sharon.
I do often wonder about those translations, Deep Deep. Sometimes they make the film sound better. I don't know about those sexy translations, though, in the French. Thank you so much for that. That's Deep Laurent with our press review. Deep will be back with us a little later on in the programme.